高橋よいチャンネル。
The Federal Reserve has decided to raise the rates. There are questions asking for your input on this topic.
Well, I was asked the same question by a certain media station. It was part of a scheme in which they were trying to throw me off, but it's simple. The reason for their decision to raise the rates is because the economy is flourishing more than they had expected and the inflation rates are rising. From about a year ago, America's inflation rate has been rising. This indicates that since a year ago, the economic activities have been prosperous, and now the rates are 6% higher compared to the previous year. Their ideal inflation rate is 2%. That makes 6% overheated. To explain overheating quantitatively, it is a state when the business index exceeds the potential GDP. When there is a sustainable production level without unemployment, having a gap between the potential GDP and the real GDP doesn't become a problem. However, when the potential GDP exceeds the real GDP greatly, prices increase rapidly. In this case, the real GDP is much higher than what the potential GDP suggests. 6% is already exceeding the potential GDP. When it exceeds the potential GDP, both inflation rates and unemployment rates rise, and so they have to exercise economic restrictions. There are two ways to exercise fiscal restraint. The first way is to control it through fiscal policy, and the other is through monetary policy. It's best when they both work together. However, the Biden administration went overboard with government spending, so now the FRB has to restrict them. In order to comprehend the situation, it's important to understand that because of excessive government spending, the real GDP is exceeding the potential GDP. Commodity prices are rising because the real GDP is about to exceed the potential GDP. This situation requires moderation. Now that the U.S. has spent too much, it is politically difficult to limit immediately, and so the FRB intervenes in order to take control. In that sense, the fiscal authorities and the monetary policy authorities aren't communicating with each other well. That's not a big deal, because only one is needed to take control of the restriction measures. And because FRB is taking on that role, the rates are rising. Without knowing this mechanism, there are some people who think Japan is still just raising the rates.
It's even mentioned on TV.
People who say that have no idea what's going on. To explain this, when Japan's potential GDP and the previous year's revised budget works out well, the potential GDP and the real GDP become closer, and that's good. However, there is a 45 trillion yen difference at the moment, and the real GDP is not catching up to the potential GDP. As for Japan's policy, they have to tighten up right now. I think the solution is to encourage active government spending and monetary easing. To prove my point, Japan's inflation rate is still nearly 0%. Inflation rate is like the body temperature of the economy. The difference between the potential GDP and the real GDP is called the supply-demand gap. The smaller it becomes, the more inflation rates rise, but in this case it isn't rising. Now they have to close the gap.
On TV and radio programs, there are people saying that Japan's commodity prices are rising.
To make it clear, because Sukiya's price for gyudon is rising doesn't mean the rest of the commodity prices are rising as well. If you are watching this channel, you could easily recognize how ridiculous that is. First of all, the individual prices and the commodity prices are different things. To be honest, gyudon's price is not a big matter. You should not speak on this matter as if you know everything. That's it. Don't show how ignorant you are on the internet. If you ask me, is the price escalation rate rising? I would say no. I'll show you some data. You'll understand what I mean when you compare Japan to the US and the EU. The commodity prices in the US and the EU have risen since 2020, and now the US is 6% and the EU is 4%. Japan is 0% and it hasn't been rising. I don't understand why people are saying the prices are rising. Those people do not understand the situation that's occurring overseas. This happens a lot in the Japanese media. They don't understand what's going on overseas, and that's why they talk without having the proper information. This is unfortunate.
That person was saying because of the mobile phone price drop, the price escalation rate is very low.
You cannot and should not measure it by only comparing the mobile phone prices and unit prices. There are millions of things in the world. You have to consider those millions of items to file the Consumer Price Index. Each category has the same amount of significance, so they average and then calculate the consumer prices. There is no way you can tell by looking at two items.
Does it look like the price is rising because the prices of groceries and imports are rising?
The weight of groceries and imports are not that high. Just because those prices are rising, it doesn't mean it affects the rest. That's why you must consider everything. The government is calculating the Consumer Price Index by including all the items. This person does not understand that the individual item's price is not the same as commodity prices as a whole. Millions of these items are calculated into the commodity price, so there is no way you can tell just by looking at 2 or 3 items.
Even so, that person said that the shared feeling in the statistics don't match, so the figures must be wrong.
That's nonsense. If you are to assume that the statistics are rigged, you can write a whole essay on that. Human beings can only perceive about 2 meters of their surroundings, and they think that's everything. That's why we need statistics. In that sense, the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transport and Tourism has made a terrible mistake by interpolating the data. It's very troubling with the way they did it. You can tell by looking at the statistics of received orders and the actual construction. The media doesn't use statistics. They talk about individual cases without using data. They over-exaggerate the significance of these cases, and that's why it's not good. That's also why many people who work in the media are not good at statistics.
In actuality, is the commodity price rate rising?
It has risen to about 0.2-0.3%. A while ago, commodity price rates were in the negatives, so it is actually rising. However, compared to the West, it's not rising on a large scale. First, let's look at the data. People who have criticized me for calling this pandemic a ripple have not seen any data.
Is the commodity price rising between corporate transactions?
Yes, it is rising. It's a different story to discuss how the price fluctuations of these transactions affect those between the companies and consumers. When there is a huge supply-demand gap, it does not happen.
Just because the other rises, doesn't automatically make the other rise.
When the supply-demand gap is small, it would rise. In the end, it relies on the economy because it depends on whether they can rule out the cause of the prices determined for consumers. When the supply-demand gap is small, we can assume that the rates will rise, but unless the gap is not small, we cannot blame it on the prices. There is a 45 trillion yen gap. I think there is 20 trillion yen unused for this year's budget.
Why are they only trying to recover the economy in small doses?
Because they can't calculate.
皆さんの質問をお待ちしております。よかったらチャンネル登録をお願いいたします。